Can you guys see it?
Yes. Yes. Okay, so.
Well,
Oh, but this is not the right one. Well, okay. Go on.
Okay, shall
I
I?
see what happened. Okay, go on with the first slide. Let's start. Okay.
okay, so here I say, basically, I do stand by the central ideas of naming and necessity. The distinction between necessity and a priority, and hence between contingency and a posteriority. Okay. The modal rigidity of proper names and some other terms. 3, the idea that trans-world identification of particulars does not pose a problem. At the time the lectures were given, it was often thought, right, or usually thought, I say here, to create a problem for quantified modal logic, theory modality, and similar talk of counterfactual situations. That is that possible worlds were given only qualitatively, right? And one needed a criterion of identity for which particulars are involved, right? Okay. 4, the transmission of proper names via historical chain of communication, or perhaps, as John Burgess said, a historical web, really, right? Though some other things not easily stated are also mentioned in naming and necessity as required. I should mention this because the trouble with getting an exact theory was involved in this, right? Okay. Five, and I do stand by my rejection of the description theory of ordinary proper names in the way it came to us through Frege and Russell, and also, of course, the clusters of description theories. Okay, yeah, I drafted this a while ago. I'm not sure what the bracketed sentence.
I don't know what you yeah. I don't know what you had in mind there.
Yeah.
The last time you gave, you made the same remark. And I don't know. I don't know if you told me at that time what you had in mind, but yeah.
Yeah. I think some of my criticisms would straighten from the way they're given the book. Okay. Okay, well, before this, Nathan Salmon has mentioned a couple of possible comment, or at least one's comment, misinterpretation of possible worlds and stipulation. Some readers have thought that Saul says that possible, this is coming from Nathan, says that possible worlds are different planets, in at least respect that the former are brought into being through our stipulations. But I obviously meant nothing of the sort. Well, then he talks about some philosophers who think that planets too are brought into being. Some of Saul's readers have also misinterpreted him as saying the speakers have the possible power to stipulate their possible worlds in which such and such occurs. Again, I meant nothing of the sort. I mean, obviously, my whole idea of various necessary properties of essentialism and so on would not be the case if I could just stipulate that they're violated, right? So, so I hope I've gotten Nathan right about what misconceptions might need to be corrected. But let me start out with some points that do need modification in what I said. Okay. First point, rigidity. The notion of rigidity gets two accounts in naming necessity.
Talk louder, so.
Okay, hi. No. In the main text, my intended definition was that designated rigid if there's an object A that it designates with respect to every possible world in which A exists, and never designates another object with respect to any world. This last clause, however, was inadvertently omitted, so it would allow that something be rigid and designate another object. The intent was for the notion A, to apply both the names and definite descriptions, and B, to be neutral about whether a designator designates with respect to possible worlds where the object A does not exist. So I was trying to say nothing about this, right? Now, in the preface, I introduced another notion, the notion of de jure rigidity. Here, the main thing is the name designates an object A independently of other considerations. So this would apply only to proper names and not even to rigid, definite descriptions, right? Okay. As a corollary, it designates that object with respect to every world, and for that matter, every time or context. So rigidity is also temperable, among other things. You know, okay, definite descriptions are not de jure rigid. Even if they happen uniquely to apply to a single object with respect to every possible world, which would have to be a necessary, existent, okay.
Okay, you were going to say something about this?
Okay, well, I wanted to say something else. My attempt to be neutral about this was not really fulfilled in the text. For example, I say, suppose Hitler had never been born, then a certain period of history might have been very different, right? Okay, so this is supposed to designate Hitler, even with respect to a world in which, to a possible counterfactual situation, right? In which he would not have existed at all, right? Okay. So this is my actual view, and my attempt to be neutral about this was not actually fulfilled entirely in the text of the book. Okay. Second point, transmission problems. I take little account of changes that can appear in the transmission of a name, even through simple mispronunciation. This has happened to my own name, which in many countries has been pronounced Kripke or something. Romina herself thought that was my last name, right?
Yes, it is.
Until she got to the United States. I think in the English-speaking world, it probably is not mispronounced, but I've seen, for example, in papers in Hebrew, where they obviously think it's also Kripke or something. Right?
That probably was the first thing I learned from you, that your name was Kripke.
Yeah.
You went on in a class for like a very long time about the correct pronunciation. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, one cousin, well, I shouldn't get into
No,
this,
yes,
but
go on.
although through some changes in translation of a name into another language, I mentioned Londres in my paper, A Puzzle About Belief. Confucius could be another case. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. Maybe someone else knows better, right? His name was Kong Q. Okay.
I don't know.
He was also called Kong Fu Tzi, which means Grand Master Kong. So Fu Tzi is not part of his name, but a title added by devotees. However, Kong Fu Tzi became Confucius in English, and this is taken to be his name. The same can happen with countries, right? Some countries named completely differently in different languages. As in the case of Deutschland by the Germans themselves and our own Germany. Sometimes one language simply tries to import a name from another one, though some changes in pronunciation occur in the attempt. But these points are relatively minor. Yeah. Third point, the so-called causal theory of reference. I take this opportunity to state the following. I do not like the term causal theory of reference, though due to reactions I heard when I gave earlier versions in the naming session, the term causals crept into a couple of places in the book. Yeah, okay. All right, well, you can, that's fine, right?
I see one of them. I don't know if the other one is there too.
And it's become prominent in the writings of certain critics and even advocates of the theory. But the term historical chain picture, which John Burgess uses in his book, Kripke Puzzles and Mysteries, is much better. Picture, because I say in naming necessity, I do not have a complete theory of what is required. And historical chain rather than causal. Causal connects, suggests comparisons with causal theories and other philosophical domains that I do not particularly like. And I certainly do not generally suppose causal connections with the referent. I explicitly regard pi as naming a real number, but it would be hard to say that we're in causal contact with it. These things depend on philosophy of mathematics. Pi might figure in causal explanations, right? But are we in causal contact with it? As John Burgess also remarks, some later writers have suggested a historical web might be better to allow reinforcement of our use of the name by other speakers. Fourth point, footnote 38. If I could withdraw or at least modify only one thing I wrote, it would be footnote 38. In this footnote I wrote, as Robert Nozick pointed out to me, there is a sense in which a description theory must be trivially true. If any theory of the reference of names spelled out in terms independent of the notion of reference is available, For if such a theory gives conditions under an object is to be the reference of a name, then of course it uniquely satisfies these conditions. Okay, now since I was not myself pretending to give any theory which eliminates the notion of reference in this sense, I am not aware of any such trivial fulfillment of the description theory and doubt that one exists. A description using the notion of the reference of a name is easily available as circular, as we saw in our discussion of Neil. Well, this is still part of the footnote?
Yes.
Yeah, so I refer to a discussion of Neil, who says that Socrates must mean the man called Socrates, or something like that. Well, I'm not going to go back into that. If any such trivial fulfillment were available, however, the arguments I've given show the description must be one of a completely sort from that supposed by Frege, Russell, Searle, Strawson, and other advocates of the description theory. Naming a necessity, footnote 38, page 88.
Sorry.
It's okay, it's okay.
What's going on?
Where is it going?
Various philosophers have taken this as indicating, one, an admission that no matter what I say, the description theory is in fact true. Admission that I had only refuted descriptions of a certain form, say famous deeds descriptions, as in the case of famous figures, which I emphasize following Frege, Russell, Searle, etc. Here I have David Lewis in mind, who actually said that only that kind of description theory has been refuted. But such a reaction confuses a statement of a theory of reference with the conditions actually in the mind of the speakers it describes. The classical description, the Frege-Russell description theory, was actually says that the speaker must have in mind certain descriptions, right, and use them to determine the reference. Now, even the Frege-Russell description theory could be restated this way using description. The thing denoted by the description a speaker associates with it. That is, that's a uniform description, right? But that is not what was meant. And the cluster of descriptions theory would actually reduce to a single description, namely, the thing that satisfies a sufficient number of descriptions a speaker associates with it. As if there were one description that all speakers associate with all names. This is not, however, the classical description theory, but a description giving the content of the theory. Similarly, for the cluster of descriptions theory. Similarly, my own position, if it were regarded as giving an exact theory, could be reformulated this way. Many considerations oppose such a view, that is, and this is a form of the description theory. I already marked a strange way it would treat the classical description theory itself. For one thing, speakers are not really supposed to have mastered the content of the description characterizing their referential behavior. If they did, why would we be having all these arguments about the correct account of reference by names? It would be very dubious to claim that these descriptions are in our unconscious rather than that we conform to them. I might also say, without going into the matter, that the modal problems with description theories in general are not so easily fixed up as some people seem to think. Okay, look, I'm gonna have to go.
To the bathroom, 1 second.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, go.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Okay. Note also what I say about the picture associated with the cluster description theory. When it's isolated in a room, the entire community of other speakers, everything else could disappear. And one determines to reference himself by saying, by Gödel, I shall mean the man who, whoever he is, who proved the incompleteness of arithmetic. Now, of course, no one ever thought that references names are really determined in this way. But it's part of the picture that references could, in principle, have been determined in this way. In contrast, I emphasize the social character of using a name to refer. And clearly that is not compatible with the section that footnote 38 could be used to give an appropriate description attached to each name. As to my assertion that I'm not giving a complete theory, note my remarks on page 95 of Naming and Necessity. I say that conditions seem different for a famous person, where when I identify the person with an indefinite description, or even with a definite description, expressing a common misconception of that person, right? But if I communicate something using the name George Smith, and that happens to be my next door neighbor, I need not be communicating anything about my neighbor if I haven't identified him. I might say that he squared the circle. I think Hobbes actually did say that he had squared the circle. But I mean, that's not a belief about the neighbor to my auditors. That now, let me turn to my view that certain statements are contingent a priori. This is probably one of the most contentious things in the book. And it's also something that I did not develop properly, I think, enough of detail. And probably, I don't know if I had everything in mind. Some examples, not in my book, have had relatively little opposition. One example is David Kaplan's I am here now. It might be right, even right. Pretty clearly, this is automatically true, though one must ignore exceptions. See, there are exceptions, such as I am not here. Please leave a message. Right? And it would be contingent since I might have been somewhere else. Descartes' cogito might be another example when phrased as I exist, or at least this has been suggested to me.
Frankfurt, right.
Harry Frankfurt, right. That's right. This is plainly contingent since I might never have been born. It might be regarded as a priori, but who knows? I mean, certainly it does not depend on any particular experience, right? But it might be thought of as depending on some experiences. Now, the two examples that I give in Naming and Necessity concern the planet Neptune and the meter stick. Let me just discuss the first, since it is easier. I assumed the following. First, that Urbain Le Verrier calculated the position, mass, and so on of a hypothetical planet causing perturbations in the orbit of Uranus using Newtonian physics. Second, that he was confident enough to name it before it was seen by a telescope. The last assumption is actually contrary to fact. I made it by analogy to the case of a supposed planet Vulcan, which was also postulated by Leverrier. I mean, I think someone, Babinet, had something to do with it too, but I'm not really remembering. This time from deviations in the orbit of Mercury, but turned out not to exist. It would not, however, be going too far that imagine that that he did name it in advance, as Vulcan was really named in advance. Yeah, is what I'm saying. Now, then I claim that the following statements, though contingent, were a priori for Leverrier himself, even in advance of telescopic observation. First and most important, if some planet causes these perturbations, roughly in accordance with Newtonian theory, Neptune does. Second, if Neptune exists, it is the planet causing these perturbations. I take it that these statements are contingent. Neptune might have been knocked off its course eons ago, and some other planet might have caused the perturbations, all due to earlier events. Alternatively, Neptune might have been knocked off its course, and no planet would have caused these perturbations. But I hold that for Leverrier himself, these statements would be a priori in advance of telescopic observations. Of course, his belief that some planet causes these perturbations was not a priori, but a posteriori. But the conditionals, right, can be thought of
For him.
as a priori for him, Leverrier. Right. Now, in his paper, The Contingent A Priori and Rigid Designator, Keith Donnellan gives the following criticism of my views. Though it might have been a priori for Leverrier, those two sentences in question express a truth, and he acknowledges that they were meaningful for Leverrier. They were not themselves a priori, even for Leverrier himself. Some other philosophers seem to have believed this. I think probably because I confess that I do not understand such a view. Now, maybe they got into this from inadequate explanations of what is going on, especially in the meter stick case. Right? Okay. One can know that a sentence in a foreign language expresses a truth without knowing the fact that it expresses. Or even in one's own language, when a sentence contains words one does not understand. Or, you know, like Donnellan gives the example of oblateness. But of course, if one doesn't know what oblateness means, one doesn't, it might know from authority that it expresses a truth, but not the truth that it expresses. I think that's right. Or when it contains demonstratives in someone else's mouth whose references is unclear. In all these cases, it would not follow that one knows the truth thereby expressed. If this is one's own sentence S, meaningful for oneself, one must know the Tarski biconditional. Actually, we need it only in one direction. S expresses the truth if and only if S. And if the less than side of the biconditional is a priori for a given speaker, so is the right. Well, of course, maybe you know the Tarski biconditional only a posteriori, but that seems very hard to say when one is referring to one's own idiolect, in which one has just introduced the term, right? Yeah, in a footnote, based on my reaction to this paper, Donlan acknowledges validating any priori knowledge of the Tarski schema, but thinks this is a minor objection, clearly having an exception here. Now, partly he thinks that my view has a greater deal of generality than I really thought it did. I don't think that any old definite description could be to introduce a name and generate a case of the contingent a priori. Now, I do not see this. Perhaps some of the trouble comes from assumption that I supposedly hold, though here I'm saying, right, that any name introduced by a definite description will correspondingly generate an a priori truth for the one that introduces it. Donlan explicitly thinks that I must believe this, but I never asserted this. I only say that it holds for the examples I mentioned, actually really two, the Neptune case and the meter stick case, which is more complicated, right? I certainly do not believe the general assumption attributed to me. In the case of Neptune, my idea was Leverrier had enough information about the conjectured planet to have a de re belief about it. He knew its orbit, mass, and so on, where it was, right? And so on. In this case, other things were true. As I said, I was assuming that Leverrier knew the mass, position, orbit, and so on of the planet. Therefore, I took it that he knew of the planet, de re, that it caused the perturbations in Uranus. Or perhaps equivalently, he knew which celestial body causes these perturbations. That is to say, in the absence of telescopic observation, he already knew which planet he was talking about and could call it Neptune. Of course, he used contemporary scientific theory to have this de re knowledge, that people had to use theory to see it through a telescope as well, right? Yeah, that's sort of something about a naive notion of observation senses. Even ordinary classes might create a problem for this, right? This might be a requirement for a legitimate introduction of a proper name by description into the language. Suppose one has a singular proposition view of propositions expressed using proper names. At least in the weak form, for someone to know which proposition is expressed, it is a necessary condition that one knows what the referent is. I haven't said too much about the proposition. The strong view that it is a sufficient condition need not be required.
Saul?
Yes.
Nathan wants to ask you a question.
Okay.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt the flow. I was going to wait until there was Q&A.
All right. Oh, we can do that too.
Okay. Okay. Some commentators, I assume that if I name whoever committed a certain murder Vladimir, the situation would be exactly the same. One author said my writings contain both the assertion that I can introduce Vladimir in this way, and that this generates a de re belief about the person so named. I mean, and then he says Kripke cannot really have this both ways, right, or something like that. Right? But not only do my writings not contain this, nor have I said this in lectures, and I do not believe the relevant assertion, which amounts to what I call unrestricted exportation, repudiated in one of my own papers. I mean, that is, that whenever one believes that the phi size, one automatically believes of the psi, the size. Right? That's what I call unrestricted exportation. I mean, other people have endorsed that. Another example, one that I do endorse, is this. Suppose, Gromina is skeptical of this example.
No, it's not that I'm skeptical of this example. I think that it's a slippery rock to avoid the other examples that you don't like. You know?
Okay. Suppose I seem to see a woman in front of me and give her a name, say Betty. If I am really looking at a woman in front of me, then Betty is in front of me. I take this to be an example of the contingent a priori, since I do know this conditional a priori, certainly not just that it expresses a truth. However, the statement in question is only contingently true, since some other woman other than Betty might have been in front of me, even at the time and position in question, and she might even have physically resembled Betty. So these are examples of the contingent a priori. For lack of time, I won't discuss the meter stick example, though essentially with some qualifications or modifications. Well, there are things that are complicated here. I do believe it. Okay. Well, I'll have to go back to that eventually, not today. 6th point, the linguistic division of labor. The idea of linguistic division of labor was introduced by Hilary Putnam, but was emphasized by Michael Dummett in opposition to my views. The idea is that ordinary speakers defer to experts in their use of certain terms. I do think that this sometimes occurs, but not in all the cases Putnam cites, and certainly not with the use Dummett makes of it. I mean, I think Putnam himself said he didn't intend for it to be used in this way. No. Dummett claims that what he calls the causal theory, in other words, my views, irresponsibly makes us defer to the dead in our present usage. We defer only to a living speech community, which includes a subset of experts who do indeed influence the terms the community may use. Dummett says, in using words or language, a speaker is responsible for the way language is used now to the presently agreed practices of the community. He cannot be held responsible to the way people spoke many centuries ago. Social character of meaning, the italics are mine. So any set of speakers is irrelevant if they're all dead. I mean, I don't know, he actually is many centuries ago, but I assume he says it's the current speakers. So Dummett goes on to say that if one realizes that past speakers are relevant because changes in language may occur, then the causal theory extended to include deference to experts becomes a social version of the Fregean theory. Now let's consider the alleged role of experts in the linguistic community. As I said, I do think that for some cases, deference to experts, I should probably say, right, does exist. But this is not as ubiquitous as Putnam seems to suggest. And I doubt that even he himself is consistent on this point. Nor do I think even when the ordinary person has usage that does refer to experts in some linguistic sense, the experts must be alive. One example Putnam gives is gold. Most of us who are neither chemists nor even jewelers or what have you are able to use the term gold and have some idea what it is. But we may not be able to distinguish fool's gold from real gold. And there might be better ringers than fool's gold. However, there is a division, here this is quoting Putnam, right? A division of linguistic labor. Everyone to whom gold is important for any reason has to acquire the word gold. But he does not have to acquire the method of recognizing if something is or is not gold. He can rely on a special subclass of speakers, namely the chemists or whatever. It is these remarks that Dummett relies on and shows that what Putnam advocates is really a social version of Fregean theory, in which, however, we rely on a contemporary subcommunity experts give a precise reading for the word gold. However, does Putnam really mean this? Later on in the very same paper, he says, it is possible, and let's suppose it to be the case, that there are pieces of metal which could not have been determined not to be gold prior to Archimedes. So there were or any pieces of metal which could not, or have been determined not to be gold in Archimedes' day. But we can distinguish from gold quite easily with modern techniques. That is, we can do this distinction, but in Archimedes' day. Let X be such a piece of metal. Clearly, X does not lie in the extension of gold in standard English. My view is that it did not lie in the extension of, Chrysos in Attic Greek, hope I'm pronouncing it sort of right. Either, though an ancient Greek would have mistaken X for gold, or rather Chrysos. His entire discussion of this point is well worth reading. I agree, but here, how can this be if it's part of the meaning of the word gold that there are experts who can tell better than the rest of us whether a given item consists of real gold? There were no such experts in ancient Greece, as Putnam himself rightly says. Now, such people, such experts do exist, but I don't see one has to refer to a linguistic division of labor here, or to any special linguistic authority of the experts. Experts on 19th century French history, better than I am, at determining which people constituted the French cabinet at any given 19th century day. But this gives out no linguistic authority of the extension of the term member of the French cabinet in a given 19th century day. They just know more about it. The same, I say, is true of gold. One could discuss many other examples, and as far as I can see, gold is the same. The experts may be even mistaken sometimes, so they have no particular linguistic authority in this case. However, experts do, in fact, sometimes have certain types of linguistic roles. One is partly illustrated by the well-known case of jade, where they turned out to be two different natural kinds. I may be wrong about this. Maybe they always knew that there were two kinds of jade. I have had to look this up later. Similarly, look at gold. We have an initial sample of gold. As it gets enlarged in the absence of experts, ringers such as fool's golds or beta ringers could conceivably get in, contaminating the sample. If we're not careful, there may be two types of gold when originally there was only one. And we may not know which was the original. Experts of Putnam kinds who are not necessarily part of the current speech community and are sometimes required to be earlier can prevent such contamination by suitable tests. Especially so in the case of gold, they may prevent ringers such as fool's gold from contaminating the sample. So that might be one role of experts, though. This may happen even though the ringers deceive many people.
Maybe with art.
Yeah. More important, there are certainly terms in common usage whose definition does depend on referring to experts. For example, many people, including me, right, could not say what is meant by FM radio and AM radio. You know, frequency modulation, amplitude modulation, but I don't know exactly what this is all about. In this case, the linguistic division of labor is to defer to experts who may well be dead, namely the inventors of these devices. As long as the radios are still working, there need not be any living experts. Of course, if we want to make more such radios, then living experts are needed. So there's a certain amount of role for what Putnam calls linguistic division of labor. But it certainly does not fit Dummett's paradigm of a social version of Frege's theory. Let me state what Dummett may appear to be committed to. Suppose all those able to distinguish gold from fool's gold are meeting in a convention and are killed in an explosion. Then on Dummett's picture, in the absence of living experts, the extension of gold must change to include fool's gold. Or again, in a case of a proper name, which might be the simplest case, many people think the piano axioms were due to piano, but in fact, they were already in Dedekins. And piano even acknowledges this, right? Now, actually, many other things are true. Piano, for people who know a lot about him, but that's all a lot of people know. So if the experts who know about this are all killed in an explosion, then the reference to the term piano would have to immediately switch to being Dedekins, right? But that cannot be right. What is wrong with Dummett's pictures? We do not live in basically discrete speech communities, but rather with temporarily overlapping ones. Our elders knew people already dead, and these communicated with other people who were older, and so on. 7-point natural kinds. I should emphasize that when I spoke of unicorns, I did not intend to say that unicorns were metaphysically impossible. Rather than, just as in the case of Lewis Carroll's Bandersnatches, not enough is said of them that we could say of any possible world that it definitely contains unicorns. Now, there's been a fair amount of recent discussion of my own views and Putnam's on natural cones. I'm not going to go into all of the criticisms and defenses in this ongoing discussion are valid. However, going far as back as 1983, Keith Donlan published a paper called Kripke and Putnam on natural cones, whose remarks I think may be valid. I really have to read this again and think about it again now. When I wrote this, it was a while ago. The question is, how are scientific discoveries related to ordinary natural kind terms? First, Donlan doubts the impression that I, and perhaps Putnam too, give that my views on natural kinds are consequences of my previous views on the rigidity of names. For example, the necessity of various statements such as gold is the element with atomic set, so number 79, water is H2O, etc., were consequences of my view of the necessary identity statements using rigid designators. Certainly, he adds, Putnam and I would not wish to count tigers or mammals. Certainly, as Putnam and I would wish to count tigers or mammals as necessary, but this is not an identity. However, the important point is this. He holds that all natural language turned out one way. Its relation to science is loose enough that it could have come out otherwise. I'm not sure what to think about this now. For example, although we regard every hydrogen as hydrogen, every water as water, one could imagine a community that regard the special properties of isotopes as so important that they consider them different substances, rather than special forms of the same element or compound, I should have said, right? As we do. In this case, where heavy water has special nuclear importance when isolated, one would not drink it all by itself. This might have been a reasonable decision. So one might have regarded heavy hydrogen as a different substance rather than a form of hydrogen, and one could imagine a community did so. This is what Donlan argues. Here, what I would like to concede is this, or I think this may be true, and the relation between natural language scientific uses has this degree of looseness that we have decided to call heavy hydrogen hydrogen, and so on. I might have more to say even about topics concerned, let alone others. But I suppose that all the points I'm able to cover, these are all the points I'm able to cover, at least in any way, in one lecture. Okay, this is it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks. We'll take a little break.
Okay, short.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, I suppose we should take Nathan first.
Yeah, I suppose I should take Nathan first, right?
Hi, thank you, Saul. It's good to see you and Romina.
Yeah.
It's good to see everyone here, especially those of you who are my age or older, and you have your video on. You're all looking very well, so I'm glad to see that. Yes, so Saul, I'm not sure the extent to which you and I disagree about the Neptune case and the contingent a priori. I suspect that what it would come to is that there may be certain things I believe that you don't believe, but that you probably don't deny either. That is, I think my view, I may have views that you don't share, but you may not actually think that they're wrong. So let me just say a few things. So first thing I want to say is I've actually published a response to you on this matter, which you probably haven't seen. It's in a festschrift for Michael Devitt. Michael is here. Maybe he can tell us. I don't know if.
Yes, he has seen it.
Yeah, but is it in print yet?
Oh, this is the second time you've seen it. Yes.
Well, you may not remember it, even
Yeah,
if
I
you
probably
did.
do.
And Michael, do you know if that book is in print? You're muted.
Nathan,
Yes, it is in print.
Okay,
Came
good.
out.
this is
Nathan,
what we're talking about.
It
Yeah.
came out last year, and it's called "Language and Reality from a Naturalistic Perspective."
Okay, well, congratulations on that, Michael.
Horrible title due to Andrea Bianchi, who was the editor.
Okay. Well, speaking of horrible titles, the title of my contribution is Naming and Non-Necessity. So it's on the contingent a priori. So one thing I want to say is, and again, I don't think you're going to disagree with this, that the Tarski biconditionals in general, the sentences of the form S is true if only if S, are not a priori, at least not in some very sort of refined sense, some very sharply defined sense. So I take it that the Church Langford kind of translation considerations show that they're not analytic anyway, that they're not just logical truths, the Tarski biconditionals. Now, there might be an exception in the case where the language in question is one's own language. And Saul did emphasize this. So if it's your own language, and especially if it's your own stipulated language, rather than, I mean, my own language is English, but I didn't stipulate English, right? English existed long before I was born. But if I'm speaking, as it were, a private language, never mind Wittgenstein on that. If I stipulate my own semantics, this is my own personal language. Perhaps a case could be made that the basis on which I know the Tarski biconditionals for that idiolect, for that stipulated idiolect, is something closer to a priori, although I think even that is not strictly speaking a priori. I think the basis on which I know it is something like the basis on which I know what my own intentions are. And I don't think that that is really strictly a priori either. But in the case of Neptune, so in the paper I focus on the meter stick case, which is, as you say, more complicated. But it was easier for me to make my arguments in the meter case than in the Neptune case. So what I want to say about the Neptune case is the statement Neptune is causing, or Neptune causes perturbations in the orbit of Uranus, that can't be a priori for anyone, really. That the knowledge that Leverrier had of the fact that Uranus was being perturbed, that plays a role, an epistemologically relevant justificatory role in his knowledge that that very planet is perturbing Uranus. And so it's not a priori because if he didn't have that information, he wouldn't know this at all. So it's that very information, the knowledge he had that something or other is perturbing, it actually puts him into what I call de-ray contact, what David Kaplan would have called en rapport with the planet, even though he hasn't seen it. Let's suppose he hasn't yet located it. Nevertheless, he's in touch with the planet with Neptune through the causal effects that it's having on Uranus. And his knowledge of that is part of the epistemic justification for his belief, his knowledge that Neptune is perturbing Uranus. And so I want to say that's not really a priori. And I don't quite agree with Donnellan. In fact, I haven't read Keith's paper on this in quite a number of years, so I don't even want to comment on what his position was. But I'm not even sure to what extent he would have thought that one's knowledge that the statement is true is really just a priori. What I do call it in my paper is quasi a priori, and that means it's knowledge either independently of experience or based only on such experience as required to know pure semantical facts. And I'm thinking, well, maybe that's true, but I still think that the knowledge that Leverrier had of the perturbations themselves is part of the epistemic justification for his belief, both that that Neptune is perturbing Uranus, and of the Tarski biconditional that involves that as well. And as you know, Saul, I think all of these things are million Russellian singular propositions, both the proposition that Neptune is perturbing Uranus and the Tarski biconditional, which also invokes the name Neptune. So the way I see it, it's knowledge of these singular propositions. And I think that they're not technically a priori. They involve, at some point, they essentially involve knowledge of the perturbations themselves. I'll let you comment on it. I won't.
Okay, well, look, of course, his belief that some planet is causing these perturbations, I actually say roughly in accordance with Newtonian theory, is simply a posteriori because it depends on his knowledge of the perturbations and also of, Newtonian gravitational theory.
It's a condition.
But that's true. But what we are concerned with is the conditional, right? And okay, it is because of this a posteriori knowledge that this really expresses a de re belief. I myself think that more is probably true for it to do so, where he can locate the position of the planet, its mass, its orbits, and so on, right? And not just something very vague, right? Now, I took Donnellan to mean to say that Leverrier did know a priori that if some planet causes these perturbations in accordance with Newtonian theory, though I didn't spell all that out, I must say, right? Neptune does, was a priori, that it expresses the truth was a priori, right? But not the truth itself, right? He goes into this in great detail about how one can know that a statement expresses the truth without knowing the truth itself. And of course, his examples are true, but it's hard for me to believe it in this case. If he does know that a priori, then the a posteriori card has to come from, well, the Tarski biconditionals themselves are perhaps the real conditional. If Neptune, if some planet causes these perturbations roughly in accordance with Newtonian theory, Neptune does, expresses the truth, then, and then the statement is now disquoted in his own language. Now, there is no sort of church Langford translation test against this about one's own language, as I think Nathan is saying, right? In fact, Neptune wasn't even a term of anyone else's language, right? Until it was introduced in this hypothetical situation, right? So, so it seems to me that this is a priori.
Just the conditional.
Yeah, just the conditional.
It's a very minimal claim.
Yeah. At least if one thinks that the knowledge that it expresses the truth is a priori. One might say that this depends on introspective knowledge of one's own language or whatever, right? But
One's own intentions is what I said.
one's own intentions.
Yeah, I intend to use the name Neptune to designate blah, 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 that, and never mind whether anybody else is going to agree with me or whether that's going to be taken up as part of the community language. That's how I'm using the word Neptune. I suppose, yeah, you know that on some basis. I wouldn't call it a priori, but there's some basis on which I know what my own intentions are.
My own intentions are, well, like, so if I stipulate that I will use the term bachelor, it wasn't in language already, bachelor to mean unmarried male. I don't actually think it exactly means that. Then all bachelors are unmarried will not be a priori because it depends on my own knowledge of my intentions.
You know that the statement is true on the basis of however you know your own intentions, whatever that is. And I don't think that's independent of experience, but it's something. It's something I'm willing to grant. I don't think the statement that Neptune perturbs Uranus represents anything that Leverrier knew a priori, or even on the basis of his own intentions.
No, that doesn't.
Yeah.
That is not a priori, but it's if some planet causes these perturbations.
Yeah, even the conditional.
I mean, it's supposed to be
Even the conditional, because the conditional comes from the other one. That's the claim, Nathan.
Conditional that if some planet is perturbing Uranus, then it's Neptune.
in accordance with accordance with the Tolkien theory.
Okay,
right?
throw all that in. Yeah, and I'm saying that's not a priori. That I say is still, and it's also not known on the basis of whatever it is that gives us knowledge of our own intentions, of our own language.
Wait a minute, so do you think it is a priori that it expresses the truth? That's Donald.
No, I don't think that either.
Yeah.
So, right, but I think it's known on the basis of how I know my own intentions that it expresses a truth. By the way, I see that Bob Stolnicker is going to be talking on this in the seminar in a few weeks. So I don't know if he wants to say something about this as well. But yeah, I don't think.
Maybe you should say, yeah. Okay, so.
Yeah, it's different from Donovan's view because a lot of your argument is also showing that.
I give an argument for my position in this paper in the Devitt volume, but it's all about the meter stick. So you have to translate the arguments to this case, but I think they do. I think they do actually transfer over pretty much this case is different because one's knowledge of lengths in general is not as closely tied to empirical research as knowledge about perturbations and and things like that. And the very description that Leverrier used to fix the reference of Neptune involves connections to the perturbing planet, to Neptune, right? And that the length of the stick, well, perhaps the way you had it in mind, there was also a connection there because the speaker is looking at the stick itself. But that's more like what's going on with Leverrier. He's not looking at the planet, or if he is, it's just by accident. But he's in touch with the perturbations. And I want to say that's actually epistemically a crucial part of the picture. It's actually playing.
Well, it is in terms of it's generating a de Ray belief. I do think that.
Yeah. It's also justifying the de Ray belief.
Yeah. I mean,
epistemically.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. If Newtonian theory were just wrong, period, right? Then he wouldn't have had any correct de Ray belief or knowing which planet causes this or anything like that.
Yeah, or imagine that he just dreamt up the description, the planet causing perturbations in the orbit of Uranus, not on the basis of any astronomical knowledge at all. He just dreamt up this description, like I could dream up the description, the largest purple cow on Mars. You know, I just make up. Steven Schiffer's really good at this, coming up with wild descriptions out of pure imagination. So suppose he just came up in this kind of fanciful way with the description, the planet causing perturbations in the orbit of Uranus. Not because he thought there was any, he just came up with this description. And then he forms the hypothesis that if there is such a planet, then it's Neptune. I mean, I don't see how this can happen unless he's in touch with real perturbations and the ones he's mentioning in the description. So the description, although the description is being used attributively in Donnellan's sense, it's a whichever planet is causing these perturbations, it still establishes a day ray, or its use is established on the basis of a day ray connection to that planet. It's not like.
Well, I think I agree with that. So,
Yeah.
So that part of it is empirical, that it does establish a day ray connection. Right. But
We have
still,
a few other questions, so maybe
Okay.
we can circle back to this if there's time.
yeah.
Thank you, Saul.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Jason. Okay.
Alan?
You're muted.
You're still on mute, Alan.
There. Hi.
Hi, am I now unmuted finally? Yes.
Yes.
Just very quickly on the point about there might have been a speech community that looked on the difference between heavy water and water being important enough to call. There actually are large numbers of people who refer to hydrogen with an extra neutron in it as deuterium and publish the formula for heavy water as D2O rather than H2O. And I never see footnotes explaining this. So my impression is that the relevant community knows that there are both of these conventions and adjusts automatically when they hear it. But that was just an observation on your example.
Yeah, well, of course that's true, and that's the scientific community, not the ordinary speech community. But I think the people who know it know that deuterium is an isotope of hydrogen, right, and so on. So they're not really disagreeing here.
No.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Stephen?
Unmute yourself, Stephen.
So I'm afraid you misrepresented me, but that's not important. What's important is the content. In the article, the Vladimir example was mine. I was not attributing that example to you. I was being a little cute when I introduced it. I said, having read his Kripke, Ralph says, there is some one person who murdered Smith, and I hereby name and thus rigidly designate that person Vladimir. Okay. It was just an allusion to your views. Okay. It was not attributing the example to you, but that's not what was important. Now, having done that.
Yeah, I think that example is in Donnellan, and that's where you got it from.
Oh, was it?
Yeah, and he assumes that I hold this, but I don't. Right?
No. It's not the view. I think when you spoke about the example, I thought you were saying that, and it doesn't matter. Can I get to the philosophical point?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Go ahead.
Okay. Now, having done that, suppose I now say, Vladimir probably smokes. Okay. Now, I was assuming, first of all, I want to talk about the proposition expressed by a sentence. It seemed to me that what we know, whether it's a priori, a posteriori, are not sentences, but propositions.
Yeah.
The proposition, okay, expressed by that sentence does not contain the description used to introduce the name. It's a proposition that's about the guy who murdered Smith, okay? And to know that proposition would be to know of Smith that he probably, to know of that guy that he probably smokes. Now consider, okay, with that by way of background, now consider the sentence, if anyone murdered Smith, Vladimir murdered Smith. Now, again, to know the proposition expressed by that sentence is to have de re knowledge of the referent of Vladimir, namely the guy who murdered, presumably, assuming someone did murder Smith, that guy. Okay, call him George. Maybe that's his real name. Okay, it has nothing to do with. It's not crucial to understand anything that one know or even think that he murdered Smith. What you have to know the consequent of that conditional is a proposition that's about that guy. You have to have de re knowledge of him, okay? But now, where's the a priori knowledge there? Okay, there isn't any. I now know the conditional, if anyone murdered Smith, Vladimir did, is clearly a proposition that I know only a posteriori. That was the point. So I just wanted to clear that up. And this hooks on to Nathan's point. I mean, he was taking a different route. Now, I wrote that article,
Many years ago.
before you wrote the preface
Yes.
to the second edition, where you were coy about propositions and stuff, and you complained that people took you to be espousing a direct reference theory and so on. Maybe there's an assumption about that, but I didn't even need that. I just needed the fact that the proposition was essentially about this guy who's involved in it, and any knowledge of it had to be knowledge of him. Okay, and that's enough to make the point.
So to make what point?
The point.
Sorry?
The point that it's not a contingent a priori, but you reject the whole example, right?
I reject the whole example, that's right, yeah.
He doesn't think
No.
that.
No, I wasn't saying it was your example.
No, but he rejects the example as Vladimir, that way introduced. He doesn't think that that is a proper introduction of a name into a language, right?
Right.
And
Suppose I say, there is some one person who stole my New York Times from my doorstep today, and I hereby name and rigidly designate her Shirley.
no,
Okay?
no.
Well,
He won't take that.
I've introduced the name Shirley as a rigid designator of someone who has the uniqueness property of being the one and only person who stole my New York Times. What's wrong with that?
Well, Tom, explain the difference between Betty and these cases.
No one has to have sufficient acquaintance with the object, according to me, right? And not maybe in Russell's narrow sense, but I thought Leverrier had enough acquaintance because he knew where it was, what its mass would be in orbit and so on, right? And these are indeed a posteriori conditions, but they're conditions on whether the name.
I agree. I spelled that out in the article. My point is that if he has if he knows the proposition expressed by the consequent of the conditional, okay, he knows it. He has de re, knowing that proposition. If you like, it's something like a singular proposition about the guy. To know that proposition, if he knows it, would be to have de re knowledge of it. Now, he may, you're right, he may not have that de re knowledge, but what was being addressed was your point that he would have contingent a priori knowledge. And my point was he doesn't have, whether or not he has a posteriori knowledge, he certainly doesn't have a priori knowledge.
And well, he doesn't, because the name hasn't been introduced properly, right?
Right.
Well,
Or at least that was my view, right?
I mean, like the claim is only for the examples that you gave and maybe the Petty case, but not
Yeah.
for these other introductions of names. So in a way, it's more limited that, yeah, it doesn't admit cases like blimey. You wouldn't claim that in that case you have contingent a priori knowledge, right?
No,
so
no, I wouldn't claim that, see, right? And by the way, I think it's pronounced Vladimir. Yeah.
Okay, why don't you explain? Because it's important, that difference between cases like Betty and these cases and like whoever invented the zipper and like even Jack the Ripper and so on, and what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think the difference is that the cases I give, one has sufficient level of being on, well, as Kaplan calls it, being en rapport with the object, right? Or being able to have a de re belief about the object, right? And then the introduction of the name is proper, but one does not generate an appropriate singular proposition that one understands.
No, you don't generate. I assume that I can introduce. I mean, you say this in your book. I assume one can introduce a name, a rigid designator, by a definite description.
Yeah, but it
Okay,
doesn't mean any old definite description.
No, but no. Okay, forget. Suppose I say there is some person who lives in the apartment next to me, next to mine. Okay, and I hereby name that person Ludwig. Now, that's a perfectly good description. It may be uniquely true. Assume it's uniquely true.
I do not say that any old definite description can introduce a name, no matter what you think.
Well, how does it differ from the example? Now, go to an example where you think one does have contingent a priori knowledge. What's the description there? The planet that
The planet that causes perturbations roughly in accordance with Newtonian.
Okay. So I say there is some one planet that's causing the perturbations of Uranus. Okay. And
in accordance with Newtonian theory, right?
okay.
We're going to have to move on because we have several other questions, including several other questions on this topic. So let's go to Mikhail.
The whole thing will
drop the contingent a priori. You may have to give the last talk on this, you know.
Romina thought my last talk should be about the contingent a priori.
Well, this is on the contingent a priori. So I just want to get a clearer, see if I can get a clearer feel for the role of the ray connection here, right? So just to ask the question a little more pointedly, right? So there's the stock objection that what you get in the alleged cases of the contingent a priori is not really substantive knowledge about the restaurant. It's some sort of meta-linguistic knowledge that the sentence expresses the truth without, you know, knowing the truth about the reference in a substantive way, right? And your response is something along that line. Well, there are those cases of meta-linguistic knowledge, but they're just very different, right? So there are these cases, if you know a famous physics professor is very reliable, and he says there's consensus in the community that some theorem is true, and you don't understand anything about the content of the theorem, then you might know that his sentence expresses the truth, but not anything substantive about the sentence. And you grant those cases and say they're different. And the difference you point to is that this, in the genuine cases of the contingent a priori, that this the ray connection to the object in question. And so we have these sort of paradigm cases like the meter stick, and then there's more confused cases like Neptune, where it's not quite as clear. And then we have the cases where there's clearly no connection to the object, like the one I just mentioned, or the inventor of the SIP, or what have you. So what I want to ask about is sort of how do we get from there to sort of a principal criterion, and what role does the acquaintance relation or the Dirac relation play in it, right? So it does not seem to be a necessary condition on a sentence being an instance of the contingent a priori, because of the I'm here now, I'm here by thinking this very thought, I exist. Those cases, it seems to me that the justification is much more structural, and that the ray relation to the object is playing much less of a role, right? You understand the self-verifying nature of I'm here by thinking this very thought. You understand that it's gotta be true.
You're acquainted with yourself, aren't
Yeah.
you?
Yeah, well, but is that where the justification comes from, right? Or is that, it doesn't seem to me to be key in those cases. It seems to me what's going on in those cases that you get a priori that any thought of that nature is structured so that if it's thought, it's got to be true, right? So it's just less clear to me that the ray connection plays a role in these cases. So my question is just, what role does it play if we want a criterion distinguishing the cases of mere metalinguistic knowledge from the case of substantive, the genuine cases of substantive contingent a priori knowledge,
Defined properly.
do you take the Dirac connection to be a necessary component, or just sort of a part of a sufficient condition alongside proper introduction of the name, or so on and so forth? Or I would have thought it was the former, not the latter.
What was the second case?
Well, it could be part of a sufficient condition, right? So that you have the ray connection to the object, and then the name is probably introduced and some other conditions, right? Some epistemic conditions that gives you knowledge. Or you could think it's a necessary condition, right? That the cases of mere metalinguistic knowledge are precisely not cases of the contingent a priori, because they don't live up to that. So I'm just a little unclear about.
Well, look,
the principal criterion. What role does the ray connection play here?
well, look, the view is that when a term, or in this case, a proper name, has been properly introduced into my own language, then there will be no great distinction between my knowing that the sentence using it expresses a truth and knowing the truth expressed, right? All the cases of this, say, cited by Donnellan, are cases of something containing terms that I don't understand, and so on, right? Okay, so then the role will be when a name has been properly used into my own language, or it could be a predicate, but I mean, the cases I have in mind were a name, right? So, or at least the Neptune case, right? And here I thought that Leverrier had sufficient acquaintance with the object, right? Because he knew where to look, what its mass and orbit and so on will be, right? These are, of course, based on his knowledge of Newtonian physics and a posteriori. But the conditional statement could not be known a priori to express a truth, which seems to be Donnellan's position, but one would fail to know the truth itself. The Tarski biconditional are actually the left to right, really is sufficient, right? Will be known just as a priori as the metalinguistic assertion, right? So what we cannot hold, according to me, is that it's like other cases where I know a metalinguistic assertion about a statement, but do not know the fact expressed because I don't understand some terms in it.
Yeah, I get that. But so do you think that the same thing, do you think that the cogito cases, like I'm hereby thinking very thought, has the same model?
Yeah, well, the cogito case was suggested to me by Harry Frankfurt, I think, actually, right? And well, at least if Descartes is right, I am acquainted with myself, right?
You know, in that paper, the first person acquaintance with yourself plays a very important role to ground what, you know, your use of I, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
And the same thing goes for this very thought.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Shall we go on? All right. Una?
Maybe we can talk about another topic. I don't know, maybe not. I'll have to go back to this at the end.
Una, right?
Yeah, Una?
Hi, thanks. So this is a slightly different theme, but I wanted to ask about experts. And I was a little bit surprised that you were more radical about the irrelevance of experts. So I don't see the cases of either Jade or Radio as in any way asymmetric to the kind of cases that you, I think, rightly point out are the ones where we shouldn't posit this kind of division of linguistic labor. After all, you know, it's true that, you know, whoever devised radio could have known more about the radio than I do, but certainly it's not necessary that this is the case. And even if it were the case, it doesn't seem like it confers any kind of linguistic privilege on those kinds of agents as opposed to the rest of us. So I just wanted to ask if you can say a bit more about why you were not more radical about this than you were.
You mean in rejecting experts for this case?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I don't know what the difference between an FM radio and an AM radio is, right? And well, I know it stands for frequency modulation, amplitude modulation.
Until you came up, until I read this example, I just thought that there were names for stations, different stations. I didn't even know that there was a different frequency.
Yeah, well, different types of, right, I don't know, right. I'm not sure exactly what it all means myself, see, right? And I thought there, I probably am deferring to experts who do know what it means. And constructing these objects, I suppose one could, I mean, it's hard to say that these are simply names that are passed from link to link or something, right? Because they're very technical terms, right? So, so I've thought that I probably have to concede that in this case we do defer to experts.
See, I don't see that at all, because it seems like, okay, so it's true that these are technical terms and that, you know, I don't know what a difference might be, certainly not in any great detail, but nevertheless, it seems like there needs to be talked about this thing. There needn't have been any experts whatsoever. So whoever devised the thing needn't have been an expert on it in any deep sense, and certainly are continuing to be talking about these things is not dependent on the existence of experts. So it seems like the expertise is really kind of a stand-in for deference to the world, like whatever actually is the case about the FM, AM radio distinction, rather than like the ones who know it. So I just don't see any asymmetry in this case and the case of like this kind of, chemical structure examples that I think you were right to point.
Yeah,
also experts with regard to those.
yeah, they're the experts, just know more about it, right? But here we are very familiar with these substances now. Well,
I mean, I'm using the radio, right? I'm kind of familiar with it as well.
yeah, yeah, you use the radio, but then you know the difference between FM and AM. I guess one is told that music is better under FM, right? Exactly what that all is a little obscure, right? I know if there's some sort of mathematical technical term like I don't know, Teichmuller space or this or that, they're not in my language, and I don't have to defer to experts because I don't know what it is, right? I do know some mathematical terms, right? As it happens, right? Well, everyone knows some very elementary ones, right? So in this case, I thought, I mean, how am I permitted to use these terms? It's probably indeed by deferring to experts who know what they really mean, right? Because they don't seem to be just names or anything, right?
Well, in my case, they were named, you see.
Oh, yeah.
Because, right?
Right, so I would have
had no idea that there was a technical difference between the two. So for me, there was a name. And
What did you think? There were two different radio stations?
yeah, something like that. And one had more music than the other. I don't know. So, like FM, and nobody ever said to me what the thing about the frequency.
FM was a later invention, if I understand correctly.
Right, but suppose that whoever invented
Hello? You're breaking up.
Oh, sorry. Like, suppose like whoever devised those things was just confused about what the difference was, but nevertheless, they nicely devised it so that it carves up the distinction in the right way. Seems like we can still all be talking about these things, and even though there never were any experts on this, like the ones we thought were experts actually turned out to be kind of like flukes that just had a bit of luck. I don't think that would affect our linguistic practice whatsoever. I mean, we can still ask things about it, like what is an FM AM distinction. We can even learn that what we thought it was is wrong.
Well, I guess it would be possible that the people who invented this made a mistake, and that's what you're saying, right? And it somehow worked anyway, right?
Right.
Is that the idea?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it wouldn't like affect our ability to talk
I'll
about
have to
it.
take that under advisement. I much didn't like deference to experts, but I thought this was a case where it really worked. Now, maybe people could have somehow invented these devices but had the wrong idea as to what they were doing. Yeah.
Romina,
Maybe we should put in the Dropbox the paper. That paper is impossible to get. That is on the on the division of labor. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Sorry.
I don't know.
No, I was going to ask how long do you want to continue going, since we got a late start, but it's now like almost 4:15.
Well, let's answer a couple of more questions at least.
Okay. Then let's
There's
turn
some
to,
newspapers also. You can be here all day.
There's none.
Go on.
That's the silly thing. Okay.
all right. Oliver, next.
Hi, so I just wanted to quickly clarify on the contingent a priori. I thought Saul's view is that you're only truly en rapport with Neptune when you know it, or when you see it, so to speak. And that's, of course, because of the kind of knowledge that he has in virtue of Newtonian theory. But the key point is the connection to the a priori is that having the kind of en rapport connection that Saul is talking about gives you a little bit of descriptive material, which generates the a priori knowledge. Isn't that right, Saul?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So that's the answer to Stephen Schiffer.
Yeah.
Okay.
He said, according to me, the introduction to the name by a description is proper in this case.
Yes.
So that's the property
Because
of the
you
meter
are
example.
Yeah.
Because you are on the
And the Neptune example, but it's not a property of the Vladimir example.
Yeah.
Right,
that's
and
right.
it's a property of Betty because he says something because the woman that is sitting,
It's right
in
there.
front of me, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So the key thing is that the acquaintance involves or gives you a bit of descriptive material that generates the a priori knowledge.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you.
David Kaplan.
David? Unmute yourself, David.
Is he wanting to say something?
Okay, there I am. Good.
Hi.
So this is on the same thing. Schiffer brought up his Vladimir case, but naming a necessity has a discussion of Jack the Ripper. And
Well, it has a couple of mild statements about Jack the Ripper.
yeah,
If it's a name, right? But actually, I ultimately don't regard Jack the Ripper as a proper introduction of a name.
oh, so that's the kind of thing I was wondering about. So let's suppose that's right. Let's suppose whatever it is that the police have and the general public had knowledge of was not sufficient to put them en rapport with, let's also suppose that there was exactly one person who was doing all these murders.
Yeah, no, I think that is actually considered doubtful, right? Yeah, in historical facts, but yeah. But I didn't know that at the time. I did mention this a couple of times, but it was a little hesitant. Well, I say Jack the Ripper, if it's a name, right? Right.
That is what you say, yes.
Yeah, but I now think it isn't a name. Right?
So let me raise a couple of questions. First of all, there's the question of being en rapport with the individual. I mean, if in fact the individual was, I don't know, some member of the royal family, then in fact the wide public was en rapport with that individual. So it's a question.
Under another description,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Or under, yeah.
So the notion has to be carefully explained.
Yeah.
That's one issue. This already comes up with Russell and the author of Waverley. But what I wondered was this: the expression Jack the Ripper, whether it's a name or whatever it is, was widely used at the time. So it's not like some name that Steve Schiffer made up for whoever stole his New York Times from his porch. I mean, this is a name that made it into the general linguistic apparatus of at least the people in London at the time. And so I wondered, what do you think about the semantics and the epistemology of users of that name? What were they saying? Did they know what propositions they were expressing? What was going on?
Well, I probably have to think about that further. I was really rather hesitant about that example in naming necessity. probably shouldn't introduce it, but as you say, it's not an artificial case like the Vladimir case, right?
Yeah.
And of course, some people might be en rapport with that's a good point, on the object in another way, not through the Jack the Ripper, right? If someone was well known to the public under another description. Actually, I do talk about this kind of case in another way in my paper on unrestricted exportation, right?
Right.
They think that I did this or something like that, a guy might say, right?
Right.
Yeah. So I'd have to go back to what I say about it in that paper and see whether it works for the Jack the Ripper case.
Would the fact that maybe there was more than one people involved in this matter here? Because I mean, in that, the possibility that that might have been the case.
I think some people
It's
think
just-
it might be the case.
But
Was the case.
even if it weren't, but the possibility that it might be the case, you know, doesn't that say something about that it cannot be really a name?
Yes, I think.
I don't know, it's a question. What do you think, David?
Yeah.
I think it's it's a hard case. I mean,
Yeah.
if you don't treat it as a name and treat it that there was sufficient epistemic connection to be able to have it as a name, then if that's the case, then we sort of know what to do with it. But the question is what to do otherwise. I got thinking about this in part because of Stephen's Vladimir case, and you say, well, we don't have the right connection, and you know, and so on. But then so I was thinking, suppose the name were successfully introduced into the language and everybody got talking using that name, and that reminded me of the Jack the Ripper case that's actually in Naming and Necessity. I think this whole thing about what I call being en rapport, maybe it's what Russell had in mind when he talked about being acquainted with something. It's very tough. And in sort of my own domain, I've thought to myself, well, could someone introduce into the language just any kind of indexical for anything whatsoever? I mean, we do have indexicals for now here. There's a second person also. And we have today and tomorrow and yesterday and things like that. But could someone just throw in any indexical for some weird, on the basis of some weird, you know, kind of specification of an object in a context? And it seemed to be no, but it's hard to know exactly why not.
Yeah, what the
And what do you think about the Betty case?
What do I think about what?
The Betty case.
Romina thinks that the Betty case opens the door for too much else.
I mean, I see why he wants it. It's because you're like at dinner and there's someone sitting in front of you, you don't know that person. And I say to so, the woman, that's Betty, the woman across me, you know. And then we start talking about her, right?
Let's call her Betty. Somebody says, let's call her. Wow, did you see what the size of the piece of cake that woman just put into her mouth? Which woman? You know, that woman there across, let's call her Betty. You know, it sounds, this sounds to me rather like Keith's the man drinking the martini kind of thing, you know, where you think that people are en rapport with some character and you use some expression to refer to that character. So Saul, do you think that you can't give a name to that woman that just stuffed that gigantic piece of cake into her mouth sitting across from us, and then where we're both looking at her, and then have that be a successful introduction of the name, at least for those two people?
Yeah, well, I thought that the Betty case was allowed.
Good.
I am the one that thinks that
I see.
it's problematic because she has a name, which is unlikely to be Betty. You know?
Yeah.
And we
But
know
maybe-
that I'm not introducing really a name, that I'm pretending to be introducing a name. It's more like a pretense.
Suppose it was a dog, a big dog that did something that all of our attention was riveted on, or a cat, or a gigantic tree that suddenly collapsed in the garden right in front of us. I mean, I don't think it makes a difference whether the thing had a
name or not.
had a name or had already had a name. Yeah, I mean, people do change their name and we forget what their original name was, and they're now
That's
known.
true. But also the fact that it's something fleeting, that we are like, while we are here, we call her that, and then it dies, you know? It's just not something that, I don't know. It just doesn't feel like a true introduction of a name to me. But the main reason I objected to this is that I think that once you admit those as proper introductions of a name, then it's hard to avoid cases like Vladimir, you know? Why, you know, you start admitting cases that are like more out there, yeah. And that it might be
I think
possible.
we should go to Anandi, who also has a comment on this, if I recall.
Okay.
I'm done.
Yeah.
Thanks,
yeah.
Saul.
I was enjoying that conversation, so I don't know whether I wanted to interrupt, but I guess I had accumulated a number of fingers on various people's comments on the contingent a priori, but some of them have been superseded. So just on Nathan's comment, I was wondering why you thought, Nathan, that that knowledge of my intention is based on experience. I would have thought that that's one of those things that I know directly. I mean, I don't sort of form an intention and then, you know, perceive myself forming the intention and then come to believe that I have formed the intention. I just directly know by acquaintance what the contents of my intentions are and that I've intended something. And so I would have thought that too is one of those things that I can know a priori, and that puts me in a position to know a priori the conditional. So yeah. So I guess in response to that was what I was thinking in response to you, and then I guess I think Oliver already said the thing that I was thinking in response to Stephen, which is that even if the knowledge of the day ray knowledge of the planet is part of what secures my ability to use the name or properly introduce the name, that doesn't undermine the a priority of my knowledge of the conditional as a consequence of that. So both of those two aspects, both of those two grounds of the knowledge that I have of the conditional, in the one case, I guess I'm thinking that the knowledge of my intention is itself a priori. And in the other case, the knowledge of the consequent, which may be a posteriori. In both cases, it doesn't undermine the knowledge of the conditional itself being a priori.
Let me respond briefly, Anandi, to your first question. It's always surprised me that the cogito, I think, therefore I am, is cited as a potential example of the contingent a priori. And also that Descartes was supposed to be a rationalist, on which he believed that that some knowledge was based on some knowledge was not based on experience, because he bases everything on the cogito. He builds everything up from the cogito. And I've always thought, well, I think that's supposed to mean I'm having an experience. That's how he means this, right? And I would think that that's the paradigm. That's a paradigm case of a posteriori knowledge. It's based on experience, right? So let me just say a little bit more about that. I'm not going to be able to answer your question fully, but I take it that the paradigm of a priori knowledge is a mathematical proof. That is something where you're using your faculty of reason and going in step by step, establishing a conclusion and believing it on the basis of that proof. So mathematics is sort of the paradigm, what I take to be the paradigm of a priori knowledge. I don't think Descartes' cogito is like that. I mean, he may have thought so, but I don't think the fact that I'm having an experience right now is very analogous to a mathematical proof. It seems to be based on an entirely different kind of apparatus that justifies my belief that I'm having an experience right now. It's not mathematical proof or logical proof or anything of that sort. It's not like my knowledge that all bachelors are unmarried, that all unmarried men are unmarried. That's something where I'm using my faculty of reason, and that's the basis for my belief, and that's what justifies the belief. Now, when it comes to intentions, I mean, this is partly terminological, but how do I know what I intend to do right now? Well, in some cases, I can even be wrong about that, although set those aside, right? So maybe I'm not certain, but is it a priori? It feels to me like a completely different mechanism that's involved and much more like knowledge of the things I see around me, although I'm using an internal, not one of my five senses, but something like reflection or internal introspection, maybe is a better word for it than reflection. So it's not like a mathematical proof. It's more like something sensory, except it's not involving the five senses. As I said, I can't give you a complete answer, but I think of my knowledge of intentions as quite different from something like a mathematical proof or my knowledge of a logical truth. I'll let the next person answer.
You want to say something, Saul?
Yeah. Well, I don't know what to think about the cogito. It could be regarded as based on some sort of experience. It doesn't require any particular experience, right?
As Hume pointed out.
Huh?
As Hume pointed out.
Yeah.
Right. Or having had experiences or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, who was right, Descartes or Hume, was actually in itself an interesting philosophical issue. But yeah, look, it is true, I think, that though the cogito doesn't depend on my having some particular experience, it does depend on introspecting something, right? Well, that you are thinking, right, or whatever, right? So it might not be considered a priori. It's obviously contingent, right? Yeah.
Do you want to end here? There are more questions, but they're from people who have already asked questions.
My question is very short and simple. You've referred a couple of times, Saul, to what you called the exportation paper. Is that a paper that's available and accessible to us?
Yeah, it's in Philosophical Travels. It's called Unrestricted Exportation and Some Problems for the Philosophy of Language. But we can put it in the Dropbox.
Thanks.
The one that is very hard to get is the one on the division of labor, because it was published in like some conference proceedings. They just published the transcription that they did of the talk, and they didn't wait very wisely for Saul to go over it. So that maybe we can put there. We actually have a better version that we work on, and then we didn't put in Philosophical Travels of that one. Oliver, you want to say something? Say
Well,
something
just-
and we go.
I want to be through.
Well, I was just going to say the thing about the Betty case is that surely on Saul's view, the reason it works as a name is because you know who she is, right? That's the.
Yeah, well, yeah, she's in front of him.
You know which person in front of you.
Yeah.
she is.
Yes, I'm sorry, right.
It's like
Yeah.
saying that woman, you know.
Yeah,
something
but
like
again,
that.
that makes it different than the Vladimir case.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I just think people
Yeah.
need to think about what Saul thinks is required for being on rapport, because it's a little bit stricter than what some other people here think is required for being on rapport. I think that's an important aspect of the issue.
Yes.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone.
This was wonderful. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks to you.
Thank
Thanks to
Thank
you,
you so
Saul.
much for coming, everybody.